evening, everybody. Good to see you. Thank you for coming. My name is Basil Smikle. I am the director of the public policy program here at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute. I see some of my students, current and former, here. Hey, how you doing? Is this anyone's? How many of you have been here for the first time? Are here for the first time? Great. So I get to do my speech. This is the. If you did not know. This is the former home of Franklin and Eleanor and Sarah Roosevelt. What is wonderful about this space is that he was gifted this mansion by his mother when he married Eleanor, and we should all be so lucky to be gifted a mansion in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the country. If you see the building, it is sort of a mirror image of each other. So the doting Sarah could look at her son and make sure he was doing what he needed to do to be right. So it's an incredible space, and very thankful to be able to work here and to teach classes in this building, especially because on the second floor is the former president's library, where he actually sketched out the New Deal. And we like to say, as a result of that big things and big ideas are discovered in this building. And we use that as a motivating tool for all those that come to do our events, the authors, the political leaders, the governmental leaders, but most importantly, the students, so that they can feel that they are part of an incredible legacy, which I like to say that we have here, not just at Roosevelt House, but at Hunter College generally. So we thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to be able to partner across departments, as you can see, with the Urban Policy and Planning Department. I would also give a shout out to our moderator this evening, Dr. Elizabeth Marcello. Hey, Elizabeth. Who's a doctoral lecturer here in the public policy program, and I'm so excited to be able to work with her every day, and thank you for your leadership, Doctor. And without further ado, I wish that you have a wonderful, wonderful event. I'm really excited for the conversation. And please come back. Please come back. We do some pretty cool things in this space, and we'd love to see you again. So thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Basil. I'm Laura Wolf-Powers. I'm a professor in the Urban Policy and Planning program at the Hunter College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm thrilled that Roosevelt House could co-sponsor this event. It's about a big idea, a social housing development authority. I'm thrilled that the panelists could be here, and most of all, I'm thrilled to have had the opportunity last fall to have worked with an extraordinary group of students on a project that was brought to us by the housing team at the Community Service Society of New York City. And that project involved getting into the administrative and financial details of a newly conceived entity that advocates and elected officials were pretty excited about, the Social Housing Development Authority. And they thought it was promising, but there was also a lot that they needed to explore and to elaborate. And so they looked to the students, and the students really came through. So I'm really proud of the students who are here presenting this evening. Josephine Hill-James, Greg White, Taylor Abruzzi, and Caitlin Penner, and I believe I see another person from the studio in the back, Juki Sai. Is anybody else in this class? This is the team, and it was an amazing experience. You know, the kind of questions that they explored are ones that are going to come up this evening. First, what would it actually be possible for a public developer to do in the face of our epic housing crisis to improve on our existing track record, which hasn't been so great? Second, how would policymakers need to structure this instrumentality so that it would be competent, solvent, that's very important, and demonstrate accountability to its stakeholders? And finally, what sort of policies would need to be implemented alongside the SHDA in order for it to further its mission of making decent, safe, affordable housing accessible to all people in New York State? So I'm going to introduce my students now, and they're going to give a very brief slide presentation that highlights some of the work they did last fall, and we're going to follow that with the panel. So thank you, Taylor, Caitlin, Greg, and Josephine.
Yeah, you can get started.
Okay, hi, I'm Taylor, so I'm going to get us started here. There we go. So our studio approached the problem of housing affordability and the Social Housing Authority through a framework that acknowledged that there's a longstanding housing crisis in New York and that the existing structures don't go far enough to solve the problem. New York has a history of interventions into the housing crisis that can be learned from and improved upon, and that housing is a public good that should be decommodified, stable, affordable, and democratically controlled. A public authority with broad powers could bridge the gaps left by existing agencies and authorities to support wide-scale building and rehabilitation of social housing in New York, and that the diversity of New York State means that one-size-fits-all solution will not work. We define social housing as government-backed housing that prioritizes the highest attainable levels of quality, permanent affordability, and resident decision-making. The development of social housing is focused on achieving these outcomes rather than prescribing a set form. So in building the SHDA, we had a lot of challenges, but thankfully we had some frameworks to look at from it. The SHDA is structured to be able to use all available tools and powers to implement the best possible housing depending on the needs of different communities across New York. Our studio illustrated the SHDA in action through case studies, which my classmates here will explain further later. As envisioned, the SHDA's powers would include those generally granted to housing authorities in New York, such as the ability to construct, clear, own, hold, or improve property, and acquire property through purchase, grant, or condemnation. Additionally, it would have the power to override local zoning and act as a land bank. The SHDA would have capital funding as well as the power to issue its own tax-exempt bonds. It would work strategically with existing agencies and housing authorities depending on the needs of the respective regions. Notably, the SHDA would have an innovative board structure designed to curb gubernatorial overreach and promote democratic control. The 19-member board would consist of 9 voting appointees, 8 elected resident members, and 2 non-voting appointees. The governor's 3 appointees must have professional or technical expertise. The 3 from the Assembly Speaker are to represent advocacy interests, and the 3 from the Senate President are to represent labor interests. The non-voting appointees would be selected by the Commissioner of HCR and the Comptroller. The 8 resident elected members of the board would help to maintain democratic control of the authority, preserving this pillar of social housing for residents of properties where direct control of the building is not feasible. Overall, SHDA housing does not have a standard typology, management style, or income mix. Rather, it will use the best mix available to achieve the highest possible levels of quality, decommodification, affordability, and democratic control. The focus on desired outcomes rather than prescribed form would allow the authority to wield its large power while still being responsive to New Yorkers' needs and reshaping the perception around government housing to create a movement of New Yorkers dedicated to the perception and preservation of housing for all. I'm going to pass it on now to Caitlin to talk a little more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Taylor. My name is Caitlin, and I was also a member of the studio. So there's sort of 3 models that we looked fairly heavily at when kind of examining the history of social housing in the state and kind of maybe what pitfalls the SHDA could be shaped to avoid. So for public housing, New York City, as I think folks might know, was a really early adopter of public housing, and Mayor LaGuardia successfully passed legislation in 1934 to give the city a public housing system prior to the passage of the Federal Housing Act of 1937. And really, the early housing projects developed by NYCHA show a commitment to kind of a universal housing program that had the potential to compete with the private market. However, as we kind of progressed through the 20th century, that commitment really began to wane rapidly as kind of there was a lot of retrenchment in federal spending and the commitment to a more diverse body of public housing tenants through kind of the Reagan and Nixon administrations. There was a real failure to serve working people and their needs. So we want to make sure that we are creating a housing system that doesn't fall into some of the same funding pitfalls that a system like NYCHA, through no fault of its own, has been placed into by the negligence and the really violent negligence, to be frank, of the federal government. So what the SHDA can do to help stop this is to generally build developments that are more independent of consistent subsidy through kind of building mixed income developments, which can also build a political base for this program. And we also want to be really attentive to the fact that NYCHA's democratic representation and the democratic power that NYCHA tenants have could be substantially stronger. So by putting more tenant reps on the board, we're trying to build up towards a system where all social housing tenants in the state have greater representation in the governance of their own homes. The second model we looked at fairly heavily was Mitchell-Lama, which was really created under a very different time in the middle of the 20th century, when the state was really looking for solutions to stop the flow of middle-class families to the suburbs. So Mitchell-Lama funded the creation of privately developed income-restricted housing, where the state provided loans to private sponsors backed by revenue bonds, and local governments could also participate in this system. So state loans covered 90% of project costs at 3% interest and included a partial real estate tax exemption for property owners in exchange for a limit on developer profits. This model really produced both income-restricted rentals as well as limited equity co-ops, and it has generally been seen as a successful program by folks that work in the housing field, folks that live in Mitchell-Lama developments, so on and so forth. But there have been some major pitfalls of Mitchell-Lama, namely that the program isn't permanently affordable, and a lot of rentals have gone market rate, which has put a lot of tenants in really deeply precarious situations as their rents skyrocket essentially when the kind of program expires. Furthermore, for the limited equity co-ops, there is the option to go quote-unquote market, which means that you kind of essentially opt to buy out and abandon the limited equity idea of the co-op, which allows you to sell your shares at any price that you can get on the free market. So we're trying to limit some of these pitfalls that were experienced through Mitchell-Lama by creating a development authority that's permanently affordable, that has resident and technical support services so that some of the kind of governance issues that came up with Mitchell-Lama as well are avoided, as well as just general better oversight of the program. And finally, the last model that we looked at really closely was the Urban Development Corporation, which was kind of developed at around the same time, slightly later during the 1960s. At the time, Governor Nelson Rockefeller created both the New York State Housing Finance Agency and the Urban Development Corporation to address kind of general housing woes and really to just pad his resume for a planned presidential run. The Housing Finance Agency acted as a financier for private developers and kind of while the UDC really represented the last kind of stand of a large-scale direct government-built program of housing in New York State. UDC was also run by a man named Ed Logue, who is kind of very enthusiastic about the program and pressed it very hard. And it had really expansive powers such as eminent domain and a zoning override. And it was financed through a kind of brand new federal Section 236 subsidy, which reduced interests on mortgages, but created a lot of problems for the authority later on. So Ed Logue implemented this policy called Fast Track, which was meant to avoid delays by moving projects forward before funding, permitting, design, and contracting were fully in place, which essentially began to create a lot of problems for the authority, particularly as the UDC made some really, I think, ambitious and smart, but maybe challenging moves to try to desegregate some towns in southern Westchester, where I grew up in Greenburgh is one of those 9 towns. And there was such strong pushback against that the UDC lost its ability to do zoning overrides in towns and villages. At around the same time, the Nixon administration stripped the UDC of its access to those Section 236 subsidies, which really kind of kneecapped their ability to finance projects. And Ed Logue's fast track process didn't really work very well. It didn't have good financial tracking of the projects that were moving forward and kind of led everything to fall apart in a perfect storm at around the same time as the fiscal crisis. So how we want to approach this differently is, one, we want to also take a contextual design approach Nelson Rockefeller was also known for being fairly into some like weird architecture that like really turned some people off. We kind of want to maybe go for something a little bit more neutral at first, just to avoid additional stirring of the pot. We are mostly self-funded. We would be mostly self-funded with some level of state support instead of being reliant on a really kind of volatile federal mortgage subsidy. And we would focus on supportive areas with supported elected officials first to build a true political case for this authority and show that there is demand for social housing throughout the state. That doesn't mean that we would not build in areas where deeply, deeply affordable, permanently affordable housing is needed to make this authority successful. That just might mean that it maybe isn't the first place that we can go. And lastly, we would really call for more rigorous financial reporting. You can't really move forward with projects until all the financing is set. And I apologize, that was a little bit longer. So we did 3 case studies. I'm gonna go through the 780, is the Rhinebeck one first? Okay. Josephine is gonna go through the Rhinebeck one. I'm gonna come back and quickly talk about 785 East Tremont Street, and Greg here is going to talk about 1024 Fulton Street, which is in Brooklyn.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Is this mic on? Okay. My name is Josephine Hill-James. I was, like everyone here, a member of this studio. So one of the case studies that I chose to focus on was outside of New York City, upstate a little bit in the Hudson Valley, Rhinebeck, New York. This is a town where there's very few housing options aside from purchasing a detached home. And a lot of those houses that are on the market, at least now, range from slightly over $400,000 to over $1 million. So that's pretty much the options right now. You might be able to find other rentals in other neighboring towns, but there's very few rental opportunities, and there's very few opportunities for any type of housing that isn't a detached house. So this sort of lack of supply issue is so serious that Northern Dutchess Hospital, which is the largest employer in the town, committed to financing the construction of new rental housing that would possibly serve its workforce. So with this context in mind, we came up with 2 different scenarios for this site that you see here in the town of Rhinebeck, right outside the village. It's an undeveloped wooded site, and the 2 scenarios were, well, first was an 80-unit rental proposal, which was sort of built on a current private proposal for tax credit housing, so it would be income-restricted housing. And in our proposal, we found that we could have some very low-income units and other units at higher income levels. These rents would still be lower than what would be in the tax credit proposal, and this scenario would be entirely self-funding. So the second scenario would be those 80 rental units plus 60 units for sale, ranging from townhouses, duplexes, and detached houses. And those homeownership opportunities would be at restricted prices, so lower than the market sale prices you see of $400,000 to $1 million. And they would be permanently affordable through resale restrictions. So in both of these scenarios, they're fully self-sustaining financially. So they would have an initial capital subsidy sort of equity portion, and then the rest would be financed through a long-term mortgage. So they would be both permanently affordable to low and moderate and middle-income households, and financially self-sustaining throughout the long term. So what allows these scenarios to pencil in our hypothetical underwriting is that purchasing this land, because there are zoning restrictions, would be very cheap, because there's not a market for land where the zoning does not allow you to build a lot. But the SHDA would have zoning override capabilities, so it would be able to build more densely than would otherwise be allowed, thus allowing a lot of units to be built, and at a relatively affordable price for the authority. From there, I'll turn it over to Caitlin to talk about Tremont.
So I'm just going to quickly talk about this case study that I just saw another member of our studio walked in, Nina Young, who worked very closely on this case study and want to give credit where credit is due. But 785 East Tremont is a building that should have been one of the 1,100 HDFC limited equity cooperative success stories of the late 20th century, but that anticipated conversion that was really supposed to happen in this building never did. In 1990, a non-for-profit organization known as South Bronx 2000 formed the Hillcrest Housing Development Finance Corporation, and they bought the building from the city of New York for the nominal fee of $1, but they failed to successfully convert the building to a co-op for a variety of reasons. So now 30 years later, the residents of this building are still living in a position of precarity, and the folks who failed to successfully convert this into a co-op have also failed to pay property taxes as the property tax exemptions have expired. And so the building was really, really almost subjected to a tax lien sale, which would have potentially put the buildings in the hand of a speculator instead of someone who is kind of committed to the same vision that the tenants have been working towards for decades now. So this is actually a rare case where there is some level of good news. The tenants of 785 East Tremont did prevail when the Bronx Supreme Court issued a judgment for foreclosure and brought the building to auction in October of 2022. The residents got organized with the help of a couple of local grassroots organizations that were really embedded in the community, including Northwest Bronx Community Clergy Coalition and Take Root Justice, and they successfully intervened to stop the sale. In August of 2023, the New York State Supreme Court ordered the tax lien trust to void the winning bid and stop the transfer of the building. And over the course of our work in the studio, not necessarily because of our intervention, but it was just kind of at the same time, in the fall of 2023, the residents were able to elect a new board and adopt new bylaws that allowed them to get rid of a property manager who had been kind of a very problematic figure within kind of this corrupt legal structure. The new board now does legally represent Hillcrest HDFC and has decision-making powers, but this puts this building at a real crossroads. So the building now has the ability to engage with the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development to preserve the building as a limited equity co-op through the participation loan program, but there are some real kind of pitfalls to that process right now. The HPD has obviously some level of staffing needs that are not being met currently, so it can currently take up to a year to assign a project manager, which already puts this project kind of on the back burner when tenants have been really living in dire conditions for decades at this point. Once they do get a project manager appointed, it can take another year in the pre-development stage before any improvements happen, which just keeps tenants in limbo for longer, and they deserve a decent, dignified home that they've essentially been promised for 30 years at this point. So this is where the SHDA has the ability to intervene. The SHDA could potentially have the power to exchange the deed of the building for the resolution of the unpaid tax debt. Then the SHDA could sell the building back to the tenants for the same fee of $1. Currently, the rents of the building are not keeping up with maintenance costs, but if the SHDA was able to issue its own vouchers, it will increase the rental income, which really allows the building to access more construction financing to pay for the type of rehabilitation that these tenants need and deserve. By having the SHDA issue its own tax-exempt bonds, it can decrease third-party fees that are necessary to kind of access additional funding on like a really privatized, hyper-financialized lending market, and this helps keep costs down. So therefore, the SHDA can help preserve the building and keep rents affordable rents or carrying costs affordable in the long run for the folks who have lived in this building. And I'm going to pass it over to Greg.
The final case study we looked at is 1024 Fulton Street in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn. As I'm sure we know, Clinton Hill has experienced significant demographic shifts over the past 25, 30 years or so. But beginning back in the 1970s, there was a large influx of a Black population who fostered a distinct social, cultural, and economic community. But as that grew, in addition to the presence of Pratt and the proximity to Manhattan, the white interest in the neighborhood began to pick up, and then rising real estate prices and predatory real estate tactics began to displace the longtime residents out of the neighborhood. In fact, between 1980 and 2020, there was a 44% decrease in the Black population of Clinton Hill. So that brings us to 1024 Fulton Street, which has had a very interesting history. It was first built in 1912 by Brooklyn Union Gas, sold to Goodwill in 1934 and changed hands a number of times up until 1996, where it was purchased by New York State, remains state-owned to this day, and remains vacant to this day. So almost 30 years after the state bought it, there's been nothing done to this vacant building, despite a number of proposals which were all either rejected by the community or just kind of lost funding and money didn't end up penciling out at the end of the day. But recent attention has been brought by Ferris Front Forest and the Atlantic Avenue mixed-use plan, which is not too far away. So it makes a great candidate for an SHDA development site, being that it's already state-owned, doesn't need to be acquired or anything. And we looked at 3 different scenarios, which all assume the same construction costs. They all assume no property taxes, since it is state-owned, and the same bulk, which would be achieved by the SHDA's zoning override powers. Just a small upzoning here. But the first scenario would be the current scenario that you would see like a private developer go through to build on the site, and it would involve bonds from the Housing Finance Agency. It would involve federal low-income housing tax credits, and it would essentially max out New York State and city subsidies. Typical Ella building financed by the state and the city. Scenario 1 under the SHDA would be bond financing at a lower interest rate than bonds that are currently issued by HFA. And in addition to some SHDA equity that would be repaid over the course of 30 years, that would lead to a wider range of income levels being serviced by the development than just under the current scenario, which would cater mostly towards the lower end of the spectrum. It would include some market rate units, though, to handle the interest on the bonds. The second scenario under the SHDA would just be straight equity, and with that, there's like a truly mixed income kind of scenario that ends up costing less per unit than the current scenario, because you're eliminating the LIHTC monitoring fees and all the compliance, and because of the lower interest rate on, or the absence of an interest rate on a loan. So, great site. Hope to see something come of it, and hopefully it can benefit the community.
I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. Oh, by the way, I'm Elizabeth Marcello. I'm a doctoral lecturer here at the Roosevelt House, as Dr. Schmeichel mentioned. But now I will invite our panelists up. I will invite John Parskevopoulos. He is the Legislative Director for Assemblymember Emily Gallagher, who represents New York State Assembly District 50. I'd like to invite Professor Emerita Gail Radford from the University of Buffalo, and Professor David Reese from Brooklyn Law School. So thank you all for being here this evening. Looking forward to this conversation for a while now, so I'm happy we're finally here. John, I'd like to start with you. If you could just give us a broad background of the bill that has been introduced in Albany and how it's different from the state's current approach to housing.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And thanks to everyone who's come tonight. It's great to be able to talk about this bill. Assemblymember Gallagher and Senator Cleare, who represents Harlem in Manhattan, introduced a bill to create the Social Housing Development Authority in February. And we've been working on it for a while. I want to talk about a more global question first, and then some more proximate causes. I think globally there's an important issue that state and local governments are confronting. And hopefully I don't get too far afield, but in the United States, historically, we have always mediated class conflict by disposing of real property to working families for hundreds of years, right? During the colonial period, told people if you can, remove the people already living on land, you can keep it. Then during the homestead era, right, we gave homesteads to people, if you can improve this land, you can keep it. And then during the 20th century, there was a massive, series of federal and state programs to subsidize suburban homeownership. And I think right now what's happening is that system is partially breaking down, right? Like home ownership and property ownership is becoming increasingly unattainable for people, especially in the urban context. And in the absence of federal action, state and local governments are sort of left holding the bag, right? How do we actually give people access to this sort of fundamental part of the American dream, like the ability to own something? And we think that social housing is actually a way to do that, right? You can give people access to owning a share in a limited equity cooperative or a permanently affordable rental home or a detached house upstate. Some of the more proximate causes are that, obviously the housing crisis, which we're all familiar with, but the different facets of it that we think we can tackle at the same time. So obviously we need to produce more affordable housing, but also we need to preserve existing affordable housing. Existing affordable housing, it might be older. New York has very old housing stock. It might be in regions or neighborhoods where the land values are too low to incentivize private development. It could be like a rent-stabilized pre-war building in central Brooklyn. Maybe, the elevator keeps breaking, or there are pests, or leaky roof, whatever, and private landlord won't rehab it. The SHDA could step in and rehab the building and maintain it as a permanently affordable rental or convert it to a cooperative. And we think that sort of fills a valuable niche in our current suite of housing programs. And it could do the same thing in a neighborhood in like South Utica or whatever, right? Because it would be statewide. The other thing that the SHDA can get at is also the need to decarbonize the building sector. So because New York has very old housing stock, for a lot of reasons, the building sector is actually the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in New York City, right? So we have to figure out how to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and the SHDA has a mandate to increase the energy efficiency in buildings that enter its portfolio, and to build green buildings where it's building new construction. And so we think that by tackling all of these things at the same time, it's adding a sort of valuable arrow to the quiver of our suite of housing programs. And finally, another more proximate cause is the deadlock in housing policy negotiations in Albany, in our state capital, that's emerged recently, where because of the affordability crisis, tenants and their representatives have demanded stronger rent regulations, and protections from excessive rent increases or unjust evictions, right to lease renewal, that sort of thing. And the real estate industry has demanded renewal of this very generous tax subsidy called 421A. It's the single largest tax expenditure in New York State, I think. It costs like $2 billion a year from New York City coffers. There's a lot of money that could go to other things, schools, transit, whatever. And but the cost of building in New York is high, so they say that they need this thing. 421A was originally enacted in the early 70s in the context of capital flight from New York City, right? So people were leaving, businesses were leaving, landlords were walking away from buildings or setting fire to them for the insurance money. The Bronx was burning. And we do not obviously live in that economic context anymore. New York is one of the most valuable real estate markets in the world. And so the logic underlying this tax exemption and its renewal has mutated over the years, and in recent iterations, it's become pitched as an affordable housing program, right? Because in exchange for the exemption, you would have to provide a certain affordable set-aside units in the building. And historically, it has failed on that mark. The majority of the affordable units it produced were for households earning 130% of AMI, which is 6 figures in New York. That's not where the need is. And the number of units, affordable units it produced was abysmally low and at really exorbitant public cost. And by introducing this bill, and basically the result of this is that affordable housing production has been sort of held hostage by the real estate industry, right? They're the only game in town. They can say, if we don't get this tax subsidy, no affordable housing will get built. And we're sort of hoping to break this impasse by saying that affordable housing can be produced by the state directly and far more efficiently. And if a tax subsidy is needed for private development because building in New York is so expensive, then that policy can be debated on its merits and tailored accordingly without the affordable housing piece sort of being necessarily tied to it. Yeah.
Great. Excuse me. So, Professor Radford, I'd like to turn to you now, because I think your work is particularly relevant here. You've done a lot of work on public housing, the history of housing policy, and you've also traced the history and emergence of public authorities in this country. You get how difficult it is to build public housing, but you also understand the allure and the practicality of public authorities. So I'm wondering if you can just talk to us about what the structure of the SHDA might look like and how it would operate and how it might stand apart from existing public authorities that, you and I have talked about their various pitfalls.
I want to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to take part in the conversation today. The proposed legislation for a statewide social housing authority is particularly significant for me for reasons that Professor Marcello just talked about. In fact, my interest in public authorities grew directly out of my housing research. I wanted to understand why the federal government had handed off the administration of public housing to agencies that in retrospect seem to have been incompetent when not outright corrupt. The Wagner Housing Act of the 1930s was a deeply compromised piece of legislation. Even so, when I began my research, I blamed the management of local housing authorities for not doing a better job. I should note that my assessment, my negative assessment, always excluded the New York City Housing Authority, which seemed to be in a class by itself. Nicholas Bloom has demonstrated how the New York City Housing Authority was able to produce what he convincingly describes as public housing that worked. It was able to draw on a unique talent pool of individuals and groups with decades of experience building and operating below market and market rate housing. But crucially, it was always better supported financially than other programs around the country. Over time, as I learned more, I put more emphasis on economic factors and less on the deficiency of people who ran public housing authorities. Maybe they didn't have the skills of the New York City administrators, but they were caught in a vice between inadequate public resources and the low rent that low-income people could afford. Yet even as I put more emphasis on economics, I was still curious about the structure of public authority type agencies. What were these mechanisms? Why were they invented? What accounted for their popularity? The bare bones definition of authorities is that they are agencies created by general purpose governments to pursue goals defined as being in the public interest, but are largely independent, financially, legally, and administratively, from the governments that create them. Their popularity stems from the fact that they can self-fund. They can pay for capital projects by borrowing against their future income, and they can cover their operating expenses by charging tolls and fees for the products and the services they produce. In addition, public authorities can move fairly quickly, since they're not subject to the rules and regulations that slow down agencies within general purpose government. Here in the United States, where there are so many choke points for government activism, public authorities have made it possible to construct and manage an enormous amount of infrastructure that otherwise would have been almost impossible. Many are run by highly qualified individuals. So what's not to like, right? Well, sadly, despite their obvious advantages, public authorities have serious downsides. Almost everyone who studies them recommends that what's really needed is a serious overhaul to the Baroque structure of standard state and local governments, making them more nimble and effective by peeling off layers of unneeded rules and regulations that have accumulated in a kind of higgledy-piggledy way ever since the 19th century. This would open the way for decisions about where and how government should intervene in the economy to be debated openly and decided on by the electorate. But we're a long way from that in New York State right now. What we do have is a patchwork of public and quasi-public housing agencies that show no intention or ability to aggressively respond to our ongoing housing crisis. So the best tool currently available to begin to build a large-scale, non-commercial housing sector may well be a reimagined public authority type agency. However, in order to create an institution that reflects our values and achieves public legitimacy, we need to think about the problematic features common to public authorities. I would argue that there are two we should focus on in relation to this bill. The first is democratic accountability, and the second is financial practicality. Let me touch first on the issue of democratic accountability. Typically, citizens know little about public authorities, so there's little chance that public opinion can guide their activities. Their boards are appointed, not elected, and given that they can self-fund, they don't have to open their books to get appropriations from legislatures. They are so insulated from outside scrutiny that even political leaders are often quite ignorant about them. A good example is the 2004 investigation by the New York State Comptroller's Office, which initially determined that the state had 643 authorities, but after several more months of digging, discovered almost 90 more. Clearly, any new institution we create needs to be very transparent and needs to offer ways that citizens can have meaningful input. The structure of governance laid out in the social housing bill is quite ingenious, although possibly somewhat unwieldy. I'm hoping that this issue of accountability will be one of the things we talk about here tonight. With regard to financial practicality, we would do well to remember the observation made by Liz Cohen in her book about Ed Loeb, and reiterated in the recent report by the 100 Students Collective and underlined here tonight in their report to us, in their discussion of their report. This entity, the UDC, was doomed by, quote, one underlying contradiction: its social mandate to build for low and moderate income tenants, and its fiscal mandate to do so at no cost to taxpayers. We have to always keep in mind that the gap between the cost of decent housing and low incomes is large. A well-structured, high-functioning, innovative public developer can minimize the gap, but the need for public subsidies will never disappear completely. In conclusion, I would argue that we need a well-designed agency, but ultimately, only ongoing public pressure to support a social housing program will guarantee its long-run success. In the 1930s, advocates of what we today call social housing thought that the path to public support was to build amenity-rich neighborhoods that would appeal to a large swath of the population, not just the poor or the near poor. They wanted to create a universalistic program that offered something better than what the private market typically produced. Better designed, more environmentally sensitive, and more convenient, not just less expensive. I'm hoping that tonight we can talk about how to shape a housing program that can upgrade the living conditions of the largest possible proportion of our state's citizens, giving them a very personal reason to support it. Thank you.
So I want to continue on this theme of financial practicality that you mentioned with Professor Reese. Now, much of your work and interest is in housing finance. And we, before this panel, we had some conversations, and I know that you're pretty skeptical about the cost per unit basis with the government as a developer. So how do you think we should think about balancing the cost of a more direct goal for government and housing development with the private sector's either inability or unwillingness to do the kind of housing that an SHDA would be mandated to build?
Yeah, that's an important and difficult question, and I'll give a few responses to it. But first, I just want to say I'm a little giddy being at Roosevelt House because Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt are two of my progressive heroes who would, be thinking big dreams about something like this, but would be pretty hard-nosed to kind of make sure that what they were pushing for could achieve some success. And so that's a nice environment in which we could have this conversation. And I'm also grateful to be included in this conversation because Laura Wolf Powers and I share a wonderful student, Taylor, who was also in my property law colloquium at Brooklyn Law School, where we spent a whole semester really looking at rent regulation in New York City. And Taylor was always a very eloquent spokesperson for social housing and pushed my own thoughts about social housing and really pushed us to kind of look a little internationally to kind of look at what other countries have done in this regard. So my own thinking on this has developed, but still I'm a skeptic, and I'll put out some skeptical thoughts because social housing is really, has this kind of very mixed history. There are some glorious examples, and recently people have been looking at Vienna as a glorious example of social housing, kind of along the model that you described of kind of mixed income. And I think in Amsterdam, you could see this, and a couple of other places, really vibrant long-term social housing. And then social housing has some really horrible failed examples, and we see that in the United States with some of the housing authorities across the country, and we all know those horror stories and see how noble impulse has kind of failed because it was not supported operationally, or not designed to succeed operationally, or not funded significantly over time. And that led to horrible failures, failed communities. So my understanding from Laura is that really the studio project here is really a project to kind of say, can we rethink social housing in the United States where it could kind of be a model, an alternative to the way we've done housing and we've done affordable housing, and can this stand as a model for a new way forward for housing? And that's the context in which my remarks are given. And hopefully my critiques are received. How can we do this right so that it's a great idea, but with great execution? So, I think John's focused on the big picture of why we need this and what we're trying to achieve with this. And we've really seen that, we have a lot of affordable housing, but not so much constructed in recent decades. We've given up. The public housing was the middle of the 20th century, and Mitchell-Lama really was like the 50s and 60s and a little bit in the 70s. But we've kind of, not really had some significant construction in those areas. And to be honest, we haven't really had that much housing construction in the last 40 or 50 years, certainly not New York, where in a given year, in a good year, maybe we'd get 30,000 permits for new housing construction, and in a bad year, maybe 10,000 units. And we think about that in the context of the size of the New York City housing market, that's a teeny just drop in the bucket for the 3 million units of housing that we have in New York City, or the 8 million units of housing we have in New York State. So tens of thousands sound like a big number, but in the context of our city and our state, they're very small numbers for any given year. And just to be clear, and that's also not accounting for the units we lose of housing every year too, because of a variety of things. Housing becomes outdated, there's casualties, units get combined, all sorts of reasons that we also just lose housing units as well, that we need to account for when we think about the housing market more generally. So let me focus on some tough questions that proponents of social housing should consider as they're pushing this proposal forward. And there's a bill, and that's a great thing, and that might mean over the next few years this becomes a reality. So here's some tough questions that those proponents need to think about. So topically, some of you may have seen in the news that the monitor for the court-appointed monitor for the New York City Housing Authority issued his final report, I think last week or in the last couple of weeks. And the people in this room probably know that NYCHA has faced extreme challenges. The court appointed a monitor who completed his 5-year term and is not being renewed, being replaced by somebody else. But he issued his final report that on one level, he tried to kind of, I'm not criticizing him, but he tried to talk about all of the successes that the monitor pushed for. And, some of them were big headlines, like the 70 arrests for bribery throughout the staff at NYCHA. But he also acknowledged the ongoing challenges that NYCHA has. And his report runs into the, well in excess of 100 pages. He goes into the weeds, which is a great thing that he should be doing. But he also looks at some big pictures. Gail mentioned how New York City public housing was a success for many years, and Nicholas Bloom's book talks about that. But really, for decades now, NYCHA, while better than Chicago's public housing or Newark's public housing, is really kind of a failed public enterprise. And so his report kind of lays out a lot of those failures. And so here are the questions that I'm grappling with, and I hope that we grapple with on the stage and in the room when we go into questions. But question number one, how is social housing different from NYCHA? And more generally, how is it different from the other housing programs that we're doing? What is unique about this proposal that is going to have a better success, a better allocation of resources, better results, more cost-effective results than the programs that currently exist? What is the special combination of elements that will achieve that? And to drill a little deeper, is social housing cost-effective? In other words, is it more cost-effective than its other alternatives? And the presentation by the students in the studio kind of talk about making sure that the proposal pencils out, but I really want to push on that point. Does the proposal really pencil out? In other words, are the costs going to be covered by the sources of funds, by the capital budget, and by the operating budgets that are being proposed? And then what opportunities are we giving up with social housing that we otherwise would use those funds and that expertise and that government power to achieve? So those are some tough questions we need to answer. And then the last tough question I'm going to ask is, does social housing move the needle on the affordable housing crisis in New York City and New York State? And I'll have some views on that, and I'm sure people in the room will have their own views on that as well. So in my brief time, I'm just going to touch on these issues, but I hope that will give us food for thought for our conversation together. So my first question about, is social housing different from what we have already? The proposal is very focused on this notion that the structure of authorities is really important to outcomes, and they contrast kind of government-focused, governor-focused boards with a broader board that's outlined in the proposal and also in the bill. And I'm going to push back on that a little bit, and I'm going to rely on the NYCHA Monitor's report, where he talks about one of his big pushes was to increase the professional competence of the board, where you had a board that was not focused on choosing people who were experts in finance, in construction, in management of housing resources. And so the proposal has this, less centralized power structure, so it's less, the buck stops with the governor, but there's this decentralized responsibility now with different government stakeholders, members of the state senate, members of the assembly, appointed officials in high-level government agencies. But there's less of a focus on just, are the people who are calling the shots, do they have the competence to call the shots in a cost-effective way, both short-term and long-term? And so that's a challenge that I'm going to say. Is this the right board structure for this massive enterprise that people are pushing for? That's the first question. Second question, is social housing cost effective? Do the sources and uses of funds pencil out? And what opportunities are we giving up by funding social housing? My personal take on the proposal, although people have pushed back on my take, is that the proposal has very modest numbers for new housing construction in particular on a per unit basis. And so I'm going to push back and say, are we using realistic numbers? So my read on the case studies is that when there are discussions about new construction, they're thinking that costs are going to be in the low six figures, in the few hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I think that the numbers are going to be higher than that. So I'll think about it in the context of New York City in particular, which I know more about, and I think realistic figures in the context of New York City would be like $650 a square foot for a non-union job, or 35% higher, so like $750,000, $800,000 for a job that relied on union labor, as the proposal suggests we use. And those figures are just for the hard costs of construction, the actual building. It excludes any profit, which is fine in the context of social housing, but it also excludes soft costs, and those are all the professionals who get the idea from conception to execution, excluding the hard costs of actually hiring the people who actually build the building. And those soft costs are meaningful, whether it's done by a government entity or done by the private sector. So this is, back of the envelope, would put the cost of a small two-bedroom in the sphere of like $700,000 in hard costs if it was union built, and that's excluding land. But in some cases, you could use government-owned land, and that's fine. But I think those numbers are just higher. And so, are we using the right numbers when we're talking about this proposal? And I think there may be just some disagreement on the panel. There certainly was in our call. But my understanding is that if you have two projects that are the same, and one is done by a private developer and one is done by a government entity, the private developer is generally going to come in cheaper. And there was an article that some of you may have seen in the Wall Street Journal just a week ago, where in California, projects being done by developers were coming in at half the cost of projects done by a public under a public entity. And there's a variety of reasons about that, and we can argue about that, but I think the numbers speak for themselves. But just the incentives of the private developer when their own profit margin is on the line are different from the incentives of a kind of diverse group of government actors who have different incentives, many of which are great, and some of which are maybe less prone to kind of keep costs under control. In terms of opportunity cost, so the SHDA, part of its funding, it sounded from my read of it, is coming from other existing sources. So let's use some vouchers to make this happen. But if we use those vouchers, we're taking those vouchers from other projects or from other users of the vouchers. So we just need to keep in mind, we want to kind of assess whether the use of a public resource like a voucher is more efficiently used in the context of a social housing project as opposed to its current uses. And we can argue about that, but we need to at least acknowledge the opportunity cost of moving resources from one sphere to the other. And so we want to be confident when we embark on a social housing project that it's going to use those resources more efficiently and with better bang for its buck, or else why do it, right? So we want to be confident that it's going to work. Okay, so my third challenge to the proposal is, will social housing move the needle on the affordable housing crisis? And if the answer is no, that doesn't mean that social housing is a bad idea, but we should just know why we're doing social housing. And we should set our expectations based on what we think it can do in terms of really making an impact on the affordable housing crisis in New York City and New York State. I think the answer is social housing will not move the needle on the affordable housing crisis. And I think if you just look at the numbers, I think it bears that out. New housing construction is extremely expensive. Let's take a very conservative estimate that each new unit costs $500,000. So that means for every $1 billion you spend, that gets you 2,000 units of housing. That's not nothing, but those billions start to add up to be a lot of money at some point. And if the proposed initial capital budget for the Social Housing Development Authority is $5 billion, you're talking about 10,000 units of housing pretty conservatively. And in the context of New York State's 8 million plus units of housing, that's 0.125% of the housing stock of the state. If you talk about it in the context of New York City, that's 0.333% of the housing stock of New York City. You're talking about a very small number of units. So I don't think it's going to move the needle on the affordable housing crisis. I think you need other tools to move the needle. But again, that's not to say we shouldn't do it. It can create a model for a different way to approach housing. It can make a real difference in the lives of 10,000 people or more. But it is not, I don't think, a panacea. And we need to think more broadly if we really want to move the needle on the affordable housing crisis in the city and the state. I'm hoping that this is food for thought, and I'm hoping that the bill and the idea can be kind of a model that people can focus on as a new way to kind of attack the problem of affordable housing. But we want to be really careful that a good idea is supported by very good implementation and design, and that's why I'm asking these questions. As with President Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, good ideas without hard-nosed implementation don't get you very far, so I offer my criticisms in that spirit, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so you highlighted the structure of the authority, the board structure. Certainly the students outlined how it would be different from a typical public authority, which we know is often captured by the executive and they do what they want with it, right? Gail, you talked a lot about democratic accountability and how we could bring that into this structure. And unfortunately, Assemblymember Farris Dufront Forrest was supposed to be with us this evening. She couldn't be with us due to a last-minute emergency, but she's a co-sponsor of the legislation. And I think it would have been interesting to have her perspective here, but I do want to talk about how just the introduction of the legislation, the proposed authority, how does this move the conversation on housing in Albany outside of among advocates, among all of us? How does this help move it forward? Maybe, John, we could start with you.
Hello? Yeah. Thanks, Liz. So I tried to talk about that a little bit. We're hoping that the introduction of the bill can break the deadlock I sort of referenced that's come to pass in Albany in the last few years, where it seems like the only choices are strengthening tenant protections and renewing this tax subsidy. And maybe we need all of the above, but that there should be another option to fill niches that are currently unmet by the private market, including the creation of a sort of safety net, right? The SHDA, the bill gives the proposed SHDA a right of first refusal on distressed properties. So if it's an HDFC that's distressed, or a house or property that's going into foreclosure, or an instance where we saw last year with Signature Bank, going belly up, and its portfolio of I don't know how many tens of thousands of units going up for auction in New York, that there would be a sort of safety net to catch those units and add to the rent stabilized stock. I think that the bill has received a warm reception, which we're really, really happy about. There's a lot of co-sponsors who have signed on, and I think it's injected a new stream of thinking already into some of the debate in Albany. The Senate one-house budget proposal that came out a couple of weeks ago included a Mitchell-Lama 2.0 proposal that was sort of in the spirit of what our bill has proposed. And I think we're seeing other ideas being proposed that are similar in nature to what the SHDA proposes to do. Yeah, we're very happy about it.
Great. So, Professor Radford, what do you think? I mean, you're in the DSA. What is your take on this? Yeah.
To really come to grips with the situation is so different in terms of housing in Buffalo. We've got tons of housing. It's just that it's it's filled with lead and it's poisoning people. But otherwise, it's great because there's a lot of it and it's cheap. But anyway, joking aside, I do think that I am excited by the fact that this really very radical and whether or not entirely realistic plan has gotten so many sponsors. I'm just really surprised that so many people have just signed on who are part of the legislature, and I think it's exciting that people are talking about different ways to produce housing than bribing developers, which we've been trying for some time, and it hasn't really solved the problem.
Yeah, so Professor Reese, if it won't move the needle on stock, how can it move the needle in other ways?
How can social housing move the needle?
Yeah, or the conversation, the bill,
I do think, so in both, in mainstream media in the last 6 or 9 months, I mean, I'm a pretty avid consumer of this, but it was so interesting that there was big stories in major outlets about housing in Tokyo, which is not very good condition, but very plentiful and very cheap. Housing in Paris, there was an article last week about how the government has poured billions of dollars to ensure that low and moderate income people can live in Paris and to kind of create a kind of Paris that the federal government wants to have. Housing in Berlin, it's just kind of interesting because housing in Berlin, they implemented very strict rent regulation, and that had some unintended consequences, made housing much more scarce. There's many stories, and some discussion in the report about housing in Vienna, which sounds idyllic from the outside, but has a very long history with certain unique things to Austria's history as to long-term commitments to that housing, and a few other of these stories that just say, well, different countries and cultures and governments have very interesting, different approaches to this problem. And I think that this is a proposal that makes us think about those things and says, let's think big picture. We all know the political climate in the United States, but the political climate in New York State is very different. And New York State can, as it has been, or as Wisconsin was during the progressive era, can be a leader in this alternative and can create a model that can provide a meaningful contribution to housing, but not necessarily a solution to the crisis.
Yeah, great. Well, I think with that, we should open it up to the audience and see where we go. Thank you all.
Hi, good evening. First off, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. I think my question, just because I'm interested in the idea of social housing, but I'm not convinced that it has fully understood the historical context that has brought it to this point. And it kind of worries me when I hear things like we're going to rely on one sector to provide housing, when in the past, even with the creation of NYCHA, you're specifically looking at a public-private partnership in a lot of ways. The first board was filled with people who were part of the settlement houses, who are faith-based organizations. The land for first houses was given by the Astor family. Well, not given, but they gave it at a pretty moderate price, because they understood that at that time, the private sector was not going to relieve the housing situation at that given period. And so my question is, I'm looking at public housing now, and I'm looking at this bill for social housing. I can't help but feel that we've given up on public housing, and I'm not sure how residents might take that. And so my question is, why aren't we learning from the past, trying to fix what currently exists with NYCHA, knowing that it is currently managed by the mayor? The board is appointed by the mayor, the board appoints the CEO, and the state has long since stopped giving operating and capital dollars to NYCHA, and which resulted in the Rad Pack developments. So I'm kind of trying to figure out what actually makes this different, what have we learned from the past, and how is this new direction going to change that?
Who wants it? Yeah, Professor Eifert.
For one thing, speaking for people in upstate now, I think it's very exciting that this is conceived as a statewide mechanism rather than just New York City or just upstate. I mean, New York City is unique in so many ways, but I think we really have to pull together as a whole state. One city, which you talked about, I mean, one city has a difficult time doing this on its own. I think we need to kind of move up to the state level. I have some other thoughts, but why don't?
Yeah, it's a good question. Assemblymember Gallagher's district and Assemblymember Forrest's district both have a lot of NYCHA developments, and the quality and conditions and well-being of those developments are really important to us. I would say that I don't think reinvesting in social housing, which the state hasn't really done on a large scale since the 70s, is giving up on public housing. I think we need both. I think the federal government and the state and the city need to reinvest in public housing, but also through social housing, we can expand the constituency of people who live in publicly assisted housing and have more of a say in the conditions of their development or their housing. And I think that that's important. I think we need to reinvest in expanding that constituency and recenter the importance of it in our urban fabric.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that, and continuing my role as maybe the skeptic, I would say that if I lived in NYCHA housing, I would not necessarily love this proposal, and because in a way, if NYCHA has an unfunded capital needs budget of, was it $78 billion, I might say to myself, let's put this $5 billion into NYCHA, or not just NYCHA, but across the state in some way for existing housing. And so if I was in NYCHA housing, I might say to myself, there better be a really good rationale to kind of divert this from existing tenants who are living in very bad conditions in many of the projects across the city. There better be a very good reason for it. And to me, the good reason would have to be that starting with this clean slate could create a model for a new approach, but I'd really want to be convinced about that because there are a lot of people in great need, like just fix the boilers, fix the roofs. That'll take $5 billion to just do that across NYCHA. So it's a tough question, and I think it is good to push leaders to explain why new is better than existing.
Anyone else? Bobby, go for it.
My hands are really sweaty. Okay. All right, okay. Voice sounds weird in a microphone as well, but really? I'll respond to the speaker on the left. Love a skeptic. And I agree with a lot of your critiques. I thought your hard cost assumptions were a tad bit high for the projects that the SHDA would construct. But nonetheless, I thought they were solid critiques. My 2 cents. When evaluating housing programs, I employ 2 metrics: deep affordability and overall unit production. I think in relation to the prevailing model of publicly subsidized, privately owned affordable housing, the SHDA would produce less deep affordability. I think in relation to the former 421A regime, the SHDA would produce less overall unit production. That said, I don't think that the SHDA has to exist in tension with these pre-existing or former regimes. I think it can augment those regimes. And I do think it offers some key advantages. Regarding the LIHTC regime, I think an SHDA could capitalize on efficiencies, could reduce developer fee or eliminate developer fee. It could reduce financing costs and carrying costs that are associated with the inefficiencies of LIHTC financed housing. In relation to 421A, private equity investors would be completely eliminated from the deal structure, and private equity investors typically command much higher returns than lenders, so that would free up cash flow to be used for social purposes. Just my 2 cents. Great critiques overall. Good stuff.
Anybody else?
I have a question, actually. I know I was a member of the studio, but I actually have a question for Professor about kind of the way in which I think our studio, we looked back at modern housing in America a lot as kind of an initial jumping off point when we were really trying to think about what could have been sort of during the time of kind of the development of the Housing Act of 1937. And I guess I was curious to kind of hear if you had any opinion or insight into how you see this bill as fitting in with some of those kind of earlier interventions in what was supposed to be the Housing Act of 1937 under kind of Bauer and the other Hausers' ideas of kind of a more universalist program that was able to directly compete with the private market that didn't end up in the final bill.
Keep forgetting mine. Thank you. This seems very exciting because the funding is much more generous. Just the outlook of the people who drafted it, and so it seems to have a lot in common. I guess the one thing that I do worry about is how it's structured and the whole public authority problem. And I mean, it's very. I was really impressed by all the stakeholders that had been written in. That John is surely responsible for.
but then at the same time, I worry that it could fall prey to some of the things that have happened to other public authorities because they're just so walled off. But I guess I do think that this particular mechanism, as described in this bill, it really isn't the classic public authority, and which raises my hopes that it could achieve some of those outcomes that you were talking about.
I think there was a question back here.
Sorry, I keep being on the other side of the room from the person asking the question.
Thanks, this is great. I firstly wanted to sort of push back on this idea of the board structure and democracy. I think it's a little silly to compare the NYCHA board to this board that's proposed. It's obviously very, very, very different. And I serve on the Cooper Square MHA, the limited equity co-ops of the Cooper Square CLT, the oldest community land trust in the city. And essentially nobody on our 15-person board is an expert in boiler maintenance or roof bids or any of those things. And we manage our 21 buildings very, very well. We just passed a budget yesterday. We're in great standing. And so I think that there's this issue of people oftentimes in these types of rooms saying, well, we get it, and the poor people don't, and they don't know how to run buildings, they don't know how to do things. And I really have like a fundamental problem with that. I think that's really dangerous, and I don't think that's how we build healthy cities. And then I also wanted to push back against this idea of like, where is our money going? Because you mentioned vouchers. And if vouchers are going to a public authority rather than private landlords who are using our money, our rent money, to lobby the state to, blow up rent regulations and not pass good cause, and yeah, I don't know. And then also, I guess, just one final thing, this idea that I would be pissed if I was a public housing resident and the Social Housing Development Authority was being proposed. Well, in that same vein of logic, shouldn't a public housing resident be pissed about 421A because there's $2 billion of money being poured into private developers to build, $3,100 a month studios? So I appreciate the criticism, and I agree that we need to really fine comb tooth all of this and really dig in and not just jump and not say that the board should be people who want to blow up the economic system or whatever. But yeah, I just kind of want to push back against expertise and democratic control and resident control isn't about everyone having a master's in urban planning or a law degree or whatever. And so yeah, I think we should think about it a little bit more, and I'd like to talk about it as a group. Thank you.
Any responses?
Yes, I mean, so I guess I would respond. So I guess here's my main point. Maybe I'm a little agnostic as to what the right answer is, but we want to compare two options. I think taking any proposal to have that you want to have a big impact on the housing system that we have. I wouldn't want to just say, oh, this sounds great. I want to say, this sounds great, but let me compare it to what the other realistic options are. Here's three options. Which one, and I'll go back to your comment, which one is going to produce the most units at a certain level of quality, at a certain level of affordability? And if it turns out that, what I said was, not going to produce the most, then I would step back from it. I guess I am a lawyer, and having worked in housing and related industries before I became a professor, expertise also has its values and cannot be discounted. So, when you have a 25-year-old write a mortgage and a note and a contract, and you have an experienced lawyer write it, they're two very different documents, and so you probably want to have the more experienced lawyer do your lawyering, and so that I will stand by, or else I'm out of a job, I guess. But yeah, so am I saying that only experts are the only ones who should be making decisions? No, but the experts also have a role in very complex things. There's few things as complex as constructing a large multi-unit housing project in a heavily regulated environment like New York City, New York State, the United States of America. It's just super complex, and there are people who specialize in navigating that complexity. For good or for ill, that's where we are.
John, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing to the discussion about like efficiency that some of the questions have been about. We could talk about efficiency by comparing, by comparing the dollar for dollar cost, the hard costs of like a LIHTC development or an SHDA development or a private development or this or that. One of the important efficiencies that I think the SHDA achieves that should be part of the equation, and first of all, I would rather have the project cost slightly more if it's going to pay prevailing wages and create good union jobs. The people building the building should be able to live in them. They should be able, so that's important. But one of the efficiencies that the SHDA achieves over the long run is by permanently, by sort of like decommodifying the land that the building sits on. And I think community land trusts are really important for this. The project might cost slightly more or whatever, but being able to remove that land from the speculative market is a down payment on affordability indefinitely, basically. You're extending the value of that public subsidy in perpetuity. And that's not something that we get with other time-limited affordability restrictions that are often the case with other affordable housing schemes or with 421A. I think that's really valuable because the biggest inhibitor to affordable housing production in New York City is, for the last maybe 200 years has been high land cost. And if you can remove that, even if it's slowly, even if it's just a bit by bit each year, we are committing to a more affordable city for future generations, and I think that's an important commitment to make sooner than later.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I will do my best to make this brief. Hi, folks. Thank you for all of this, and I've been really excited to sort of watch along. I have a question, I think, again, about some of the effects that we're talking about here, about what kind of housing that we're producing through a social housing development authority. And I'd like to focus a little bit not on the new construction side, which I think gets a lot of time and attention, both in sort of the scope of all our alternatives in 421A, and also in the scope of our historical examples, thinking about drawing from public housing, drawing from Mitchell-Lamas as sort of our continuous line to a social housing authority. I think it's John who mentioned that, the Social Housing Development Authority would also have the ability to enact a first right of refusal for distressed rental properties or cooperatives or other sort of buildings, single-family homes as well, and move them into sort of like the control of the SHDA and provide that kind of financing. I think Professor Reese mentioned, the Signature Bank collapse and sort of the really drastic sort of crisis that we're in terms of rent stabilized and rental sort of housing overall, especially pre-war housing, which New York and New York City has a lot of. And I think that Caitlin's sort of proposal in the studio, thinking about the building in East Tremont, speaks to this also, in sort of what to do with these sort of preservation aspects as well. And I wonder if folks might be able to talk a little bit about that sort of side of the bill and how the SHDA focuses on, this sort of yes and perhaps approach, the new construction side and the preservation, and what other benefits might come from that kind of orientation.
John, you want to take a stab?
Yeah, so great question, and you're right, that's a really, really important piece of the bill, maybe even more important than the new construction aspect in terms of the niche that it's filling or that it could fill in the near term, is this ability first to have a right of first refusal on distressed housing, which is defined as either financial or physical distress, but also to act as a qualified purchaser on behalf of tenants who want to take over their building via TOPA, if that gets passed, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, or to act as a financial partner for land trusts. I think that, you know, we have other preservation programs that are very important, but the ability of the SHDA to sort of increase this safety net for housing, to keep people in their homes, to prevent speculators from, you know, taking over housing via tax lien sales. I think that the lack of a safety net was illustrated after 2008, right, where this issue of zombie homes persisted across the state for years. You know, homes that were foreclosed on and then vacated and left in legal limbo for many, many years. You know, a Signature Bank collapse isn't going to happen all the time, and a 2008 financial crisis hopefully isn't going to happen all the time, but having that safety net in place and having an additional partner for people who want to convert their building to a limited equity cooperative or for land trusts is, I think, just a very valuable contribution to the overall landscape in a place where maybe a bigger contribution can be made than just the SHDA's like raw ability to build new units every year.
Gail, did you want to?
I see this part of the bill as a way to link New York City to the rest of the state. Because I was kidding before about how we have lots of housing and it's in bad shape. If more restrictions could be put on landlords, and that would mean a lot of this property could be taken over by the city, by various entities, and refurbished and become a valuable resource. In other ways, we're so different, but this ability to move things up to the state level, I think, is really important. This is a piece that could do that, I think.
I would just go back to the theme of opportunity costs. So what, you know, which program spends the dollar most efficiently to get you preservation? And that would be my I guess I'm revealing my policy preferences, but I'm all about I'm all about housing production, increasing, you know, quality housing. And so if the SHDA used preservation dollars more efficiently than current programs, I'd be like, oh, I'm all for that. But if it had other policy preferences and that it was implementing, or it was not operationally as efficient as other programs, then I wouldn't like that. And so I guess the hard-nosed question that I would ask is the SHDA model going to more efficiently preserve more units of housing than existing models or alternative models? And that's the question I would ask. And I don't have an opinion on it. You know, I don't, you know, preservation, it's a little harder to kind of, to think about those numbers for me. You know, like I know the studio came up with some preservation models. I don't feel competent to evaluate those preservation numbers, but that would be the question I would ask to determine if I thought that was the best way to go.
Great. So I know before the panel we were joking that I just had a bunch of questions that no one had an answer to. But I hope we've raised even more questions this evening, given us more to think about. I'd like to thank Professor Wolf Powers, the students, and of course the panelists for your time this evening. Thank you.